In Chapter 1, we took a brief overview of nutrition as well as the importance of nutrients as to how they're necessary for our body to function properly. Moving on to Chapter 2, we're going to look at how we can go about making appropriate food selections to help with our goals of both health promotion and disease prevention. What have been developed to help us make some healthy food choices are what are known as the diet planning principles. Now, the first thing to note is the word diet. We usually assume diet with maybe something restrictive or even something negative. If you were to look at the true definition of diet, it very simply is the foods and beverages a person eats and drinks. So there really does not need to be a negative connotation with that term. It actually just is the foods that we're selecting and how they work into our intake on a daily basis. So these diet planning principles, the first one to note is what's known as adequacy, simply defined as providing all the essential nutrients, fiber, and energy meaning the calories, in amounts that are sufficient to maintain our health. So basically just making sure that we are making selections that are going to cover all of the bases as far as adequate nutrients go. For example, making sure that we're taking in enough calcium. Calcium for bone health, for bone density, would fall under this example. The next, balance. Balance refers to providing foods in proportion to one another, as well as in proportion to the body's needs. Basically, balance is going to ensure adequacy. If you're focusing on consuming foods from every food group, you're going to be getting a nice array of nutrients, not allowing one food or food group to crowd out another. The third diet planning principle is calorie control or energy control. Very simply, making sure that you're taking in an appropriate amount of calories that's not going to provide you with excess amounts. As long as we're taking in a certain amount of calories and expending a certain amount of calories, our weight is going to remain stable. The fourth diet planning principle is what's known as nutrient density. And nutrient density is defined as a measure of the nutrients a food provides relative to the energy it provides. To put it in a more simple way, the more nutrients and the fewer calories that a food has, the higher its nutrient density. As an example here, if we were to compare, say, a serving of chocolate milk versus a serving of, say, skim milk, which one is going to provide you with more calories in comparison to nutrients? Well, obviously, the chocolate milk is going to be higher in calories than, say, a serving of skim milk. Because of that, we're going to assume then that the skim milk is going to be more nutrient dense. You get a larger amount of nutrients compared to the amount of calories. Another term to be familiar with are empty calories, and these are foods that we want to limit. Basically, they're not providing us with much nutritional value. They're lacking in protein, vitamins, as well as minerals. Examples of empty calorie foods would be something like soda, candy bars, maybe potato chips, things which, again, are just providing you with calories and no substantial nutritional value. This slide will also give us an example of nutrient density. If you look at the two breakfasts that are depicted here, the breakfast on the left is noted as a nutrient-dense breakfast, whereas the breakfast on the right is designated as a nutrient-poor breakfast. Now, calorie-wise, they're actually very, very close. However, look at the difference in nutrient value. The nutrient-dense breakfast provides much more protein, fiber, vitamin A, vitamin C, calcium, as well as iron. So since there are going to be more nutrients provided compared to calories, that actually is a great example of a nutrient-dense type of a meal. The next planning principle is moderation, providing enough but not too much of a particular nutrient or some other type of a substance. Moderation is going to contribute very greatly to the other diet planning principles of adequacy, balance, as well as calorie control. So what does it mean to actually practice moderation? It means that, say, foods that you know are high in sodium, high in sugar, high in saturated fat, you incorporate them maybe occasionally as opposed to indulging in them on a daily basis. The last diet planning principle is variety, and variety is very important. Eating a wide selection of foods within as well as among the various food groups. By doing that, it also is going to help provide with adequacy. There's an old adage, which some of you might be familiar with, which is variety is the spice of life. If you are mixing it up, if you are focusing on trying new foods, they're all going to be containing different types of nutrients, different combinations of things like phytochemicals, which we'll discuss at a later time, which will overall just help with achieving a very well-balanced intake. So to get us started in the right direction as far as selecting appropriate foods, various health organizations have contributed to guidelines. One in particular is the USDA, or the U.S. Department of Agriculture, who has developed what are known as food patterns. These food patterns assign foods to, very simply, the 5 major food groups. These are fruits, vegetables, grains, meat and legumes, or the protein sources basically, as well as milk and dairy. They have determined an appropriate amount of calories. The calories are based on how active you are, what your gender may be, or what your age may be. And you're going to see that there's a difference in those categories. Then they also provide you with further information depending on particular food groups. In particular, they have given more information on 2 specific food groups. The first are the vegetables. And if you look at the listings of the foods under the food patterns, you're going to see that the vegetables are divided up based on their color as well as their nutrient and starch content. It's encouraged to try to incorporate variety within this particular food group for various health benefits. Then the second group, which has a little bit more detail, again through the food patterns, is the protein group. This group has been subdivided into seafood, and then meat, poultry, and eggs. Then finally nuts, seeds, and soy products, and the legumes are incorporated into this category also. Legumes fall under the veggies, but because of their protein content, we can also work them in as a protein. Each one of these subgroups contains a different amount of fat. They also contain a different type of fat, as well as various combinations of amino acids. So how many calories should you be consuming? Well, if you look at this table here, which was developed again in accordance with the USDA food patterns, you could see that it's going to vary based once again on your age and your gender as well as your overall activity level. It's not the most accurate method to determine how much you actually need, but for most people it can really be a good starting point. So once you have an idea about how many calories you should be focusing on, you can go ahead and take a look at this particular table. These are the recommended daily amounts for all of the food groups, depending on what your caloric allotment has been determined to be. You can see it tells you exactly how many servings you need from each one of those 5 food groups. Then there's another category that's noted. This is the oils category. Technically, it is not a food group, but it is included here under the food patterns. Oils are an important source, especially of essential fatty acids, which we'll talk about those in Chapter 5. And since they are part of so many different foods that we're consuming, they're included here as some additional information for us to go ahead and use. The last row that you note on this table is calories available for other uses. Another term for these are discretionary calories, and we're going to talk about those in just a bit. These next 3 slides will show the food groups themselves, as well as some important information about each one. If we look at the first food group here, you'll see fruits are noted, and it specifically states the nutrients which you will find in very high amounts in this particular food group. Folate, vitamin A, vitamin C, potassium, as well as fiber. Then you'll see that pretty much every fruit that you can imagine is found here, as well as fruit juices. There's also additional information as far as foods that, yes, you would consider as a serving of fruit, but you want to be careful because they have some added sugars or maybe potentially some added fats. So things like fruit punch, fruit which is packed in syrup, and so on. Yes, they do count as a serving of fruit. However, they do have some of the extra sugar which we are actually trying to decrease in our diet. The next food group you could see are the vegetables, and again the important information is listed as far as the nutrients which we will find in large amounts. Folate, vitamin A, vitamin C, magnesium, and so forth. If you look a little bit closer, you'll also see that the vegetables are subdivided. There's those that are categorized as being dark green. There's those which are red and orange. There are the legumes, which include the dried peas, the dried beans. Then there's the starchy vegetables, things like corn, potatoes. And then we have the other veggies. These often are referred to as leafy veggies to some extent. So maybe things like lettuce. Romaine lettuce is very high in nutrient value, so we want to include that. Asparagus, cabbage, zucchini, things along that line. And again, you have the information about some vegetables which may actually, yes, count as a serving of vegetables, but they do have that potential for having some extra fat or added sugar added to them. The next food group include the grains. Once again, you could see the nutrients which we're going to find in larger amounts in this particular food group. Folate, niacin, riboflavin, thiamine, iron, magnesium, selenium, and fiber. What we want to try to do with this group is to select those grains which are actually noted as being whole grains. That's a very key term to be aware of. And further on in Chapter 2, we'll go into much more detail about why whole grains are so important to include on a daily basis. Again, there's the information as far as grains which may have some added fat or added sugar added that you want to be a little bit more careful with. The next food group, these are the proteins. And these are also subdivided into different groups. These include seafood, they include meats, poultry, as well as eggs as the second subgroup, and then nuts, seeds, and soy products. These protein sources are grouped together based mostly on the type of fat that they contain, meaning are they higher in saturated fat versus unsaturated fat. They're also subdivided based upon their amino acid composition. And we'll talk about amino acids a little bit more in Chapter 6. Again, too, you can see protein foods that you want to be a little bit more careful with that may have some of those added fats and added sugars. The next food group to note include milk and milk products. These predominantly are going to be sources of protein, riboflavin, vitamin B12, calcium, potassium, as well as the fortified versions containing vitamin A and vitamin D. There are milk and milk products which are categorized as being fat-free or low-fat, or you can also get the whole fat version or the full fat version. Again, as with the other foods, just be careful with the milk and milk products that have the additional fats and sugars added to them when you're making your selections. Lastly, there is what we refer to as the oils. The oils are technically not a food group. However, because they contribute such a large amount of the necessary nutrient vitamin E as well as essential fatty acids, they are noted here. Ideally, what we want to do is select oils instead of solid fats. And when we go through Chapter 5, we're going to go through this in much more detail and differentiate between those fats which are solid, those which are liquid, those are which are unsaturated, and those that are saturated. In slide number 7, we saw the USDA food patterns, and I mentioned the category which was noted as limit on calories for other uses. These are also referred to as discretionary calories. So again, if you consume all of the food groups in the recommended amounts that you've determined for your caloric allotment, you're still going to have excess calories left over. You can then use these to work in maybe snacks that are providing you with a bit more fat or sugar. You can work in maybe a serving of alcohol, a serving of wine, a serving of beer, or you can simply eat more nutrient-dense foods to provide you with these discretionary calories. If you are looking for weight loss, very simply just don't use these discretionary calories, and this will provide a deficit, therefore again supporting weight reduction. Here you can see a visual representation of how discretionary calories work. So for example, for a 2,000 calorie intake, if you were to consume all of those recommended food groups in the appropriate amounts, you're still going to have leftover calories. And in this case, it's about 250, or specifically 258 extra calories to use. Again, however you wish. You can add on maybe some snacks, some foods with a higher fat or sugar content, serving of alcohol, or if you are trying to lose weight, you simply are not going to use that allotment of discretionary calories. In addition to the USDA creating the food patterns, it also has developed a tool called MyPlate, which is a simple depiction of the 5 food groups, obviously in a plate-like icon. If you look, you can see the 5 food groups are all noted: fruits, vegetables, grains, protein, as well as dairy. What you want to pay attention to is the proportion of the food group on the actual plate itself. The sections vary in size, and if you look, you could see that grains, fruits, and vegetables actually make up about 75% of those 5 food groups. What we're trying to get consumers to do is to consider incorporating more plant-based foods into their food choices. Why is that? Well, what's being found or being noted is that a plant-based diet has quite a few health benefits, which we'll note in just a little bit. Another thing that you'll notice on this slide is that the website is noted, choosemyplate.gov. This is a great website. You can go on there. There's different activities, there's different information, there's different resources that can really help to go in the direction, once again, of developing very healthy eating patterns. So let's take a look at these plant-based diets. Depending on the particular food group that you may be excluding or the food groups that you are consuming, can actually play a role as far as how balanced or healthy of a diet can actually be achieved. The foods that are limited depend upon what type of vegetarian guideline or vegetarianism is actually being followed. There are different classifications for those who choose to follow a vegetarian type of a diet. There are those which are referred to as lacto-ovo vegetarians who exclude meat, poultry, and fish. However, they're still consuming some animal products in the form of milk and dairy as well as eggs. Then there are the lacto vegetarians who are excluding, again, meat, poultry, and fish, but also in addition are not eating eggs. They are, however, consuming the milk and the dairy group. Those who are classified as ovo vegetarians are excluding meat, poultry, fish, as well as milk and dairy products. However, they will consume eggs. The last classification are those who are vegans, and this is the strictest form of vegetarianism. You could see that all animal products are completely excluded. So in this case, they are truly following a plant-based guideline. So what are some alternatives then if someone is completely excluding the meat group? Well, tofu, any type of a soy product, legumes, nuts, nut butters, and seeds can all offer sources of protein. Then what would be the alternative if somebody is excluding milk or dairy? Well, one option is soy milk. Soy milk is comparable in nutrient value when we're talking about protein content, calcium content, vitamin D content, as compared to regular animal milk or cow's milk or goat's milk. Other alternatives, coconut milk, rice milk, almond milk can be used also. However, with that particular group, you really need to look at the label, because what you might often find is that they tend to be extremely low in protein content. So they may not be the best substitution if you're focusing on protein intake. Then other types of dairy products can be produced from other sources. Yogurt, cheese, ice cream, those are now being manufactured from non-milk or soy sources. You might have seen that there is yogurt being made from coconut milk. You might have seen that there's ice cream that's soy-based. All of those can be considered to be appropriate alternatives. With the exclusion then of animal-based foods, there may be a question as to how we can ensure adequate protein. It's not as much of an issue of adequate amounts of protein, but more so about getting adequate amounts of essential amino acids. As you recall from chemistry, amino acids are the building blocks of protein. Amino acids link together to form protein strands. Amino acids are either classified as being non-essential or essential. Now, the non-essential amino acids our body can make, so we don't have to get them from dietary sources. Essential amino acids, on the other hand, our body can't make or can't make in sufficient amounts, so we have to rely on dietary sources. Now, animal-based proteins have all of these essential amino acids, and they're referred to as a complete or a high-quality protein. Plant-based foods, on the other hand, there are some which do contain all of these essential amino acids. And some of those include soybeans, quinoa, chia seeds, hemp seeds, buckwheat, as well as spirulina. Spirulina is a type of seaweed or algae, which again will contain all the essential amino acids. Most other plant proteins, however, are designated as being incomplete, meaning that they don't contain all of the essential amino acids. So what can we do then to make sure that we are getting not only adequate amounts of protein, but protein that contains all of those essential amino acids if we're following a more plant-based diet? Well, very simply, you can combine different food groups. You can combine together a serving of grains with a serving of legumes. Basic example, rice and beans. That combination is going to give you all of the essential amino acids that your body can then use. Combining legumes with nuts and seeds, another way to get all of those essential amino acids. Examples here, something like a trail mix. One thing to note, legumes. Peanuts are actually legumes. They are technically not nuts. They are legumes. So if you put together a trail mix that has peanuts and then additional tree nuts such as cashews, walnuts, pecans, and then also add maybe some pumpkin seeds, some hemp seeds, between all of those foods, you are going to get all of the essential amino acids. Then a combination of milk product combined with a grain. If you are using, say, cow's milk or some type of animal milk, that can be the milk product there. And very simply, adding it to cereal will give you all of the essential amino acids. This is a process that's been known for years as protein complementation. When we're talking about the nutrients, which may be more of an issue, especially with vegans, the most strictest type of vegetarian, it is that complete, or what we refer to as high quality protein, which may sometimes be lacking. Calories can also be an issue. Plant-based diets tend to be high in fiber. Fiber tends to be very filling. So often, one becomes very full without being able to consume adequate amounts of calories. Then other nutrients which can be an issue, especially with vegans, include vitamin D, B12, riboflavin, iron, as well as calcium. Paying attention to intake of foods which do contain these can be helpful, but often taking a good multivitamin as well as having the mineral content of iron and calcium be present is recommended at times. Many health organizations are recommending that we don't necessarily follow a strict vegetarian diet, but that we incorporate more plant-based foods. And many studies have shown that there are definitely health benefits associated with this type of a dietary guideline. Lower and healthier body weight may result, a decreased risk of diabetes, specifically type 2 diabetes, which we'll discuss in more detail in chapter 18, a decreased risk of certain types of cancer, as well as a decreased risk of heart disease, cardiovascular disease, as well as hypertension. After looking at the diet planning principles and the food pattern guidelines, where do we go now? Or how do we start towards a healthier eating trend? Well, the first thing you want to do is consider the foods you enjoy and make improvements from there. Consider if you're somebody who might be including red meat several times a week. Suppose you're having red meat, say, 4 or 5 times a week. What can you do? Well, consider substituting other sources of leaner protein, maybe plant-based protein, 1 or 2 of those days. Then suppose when you are dining out, as a side, you always go and select French fries. Well, as a change of pace, or to make an improvement, maybe instead of the French fries, order quinoa, or incorporate a salad, incorporate a side of fruit. Those are some very subtle types of improvements that'll start you on a healthier trend as far as eating goes. One of the major issues, especially here in the United States, is our large consumption of processed foods. Processed foods in general tend to have a lower amount of nutrients and additional amounts of sugar, fat, and sodium. In fact, a high percentage of Americans exceed the recommended limits for these categories on a daily basis. What we want to do is actually focus more so on selecting foods that are minimally processed as opposed to ultra-processed. And in the textbook, on page 49, there's really a great example of these two categories. The example involves corn. Corn that is frozen is minimally processed. However, if you were to compare that to something like corn chips, those are ultra-processed. Now, the corn chips are coming from the same source. They're coming from corn itself. However, because of the many steps involved in the processing, it bears little resemblance as far as nutrient content goes to, say, the frozen corn. Also, you are going to have additional sodium added. There's probably additional fat being added, which turns it into this category of an ultra-processed food. This is the category we really need to try to decrease our consumption of on a daily basis. We'll take a look now at the actual 5 food groups and which specific foods within each are considered to be healthy choices. We're going to start off with the grain group. And we're going to look at various terms that are kind of a red flag as far as nutritional value. Also, on slide 24, there is a depiction of an actual wheat grain. So you can visualize the various portions that I'm going to note when I'm talking about these particular terms. So, refined. What does the term refined mean? It means that the grains have had a coarse part of their makeup removed, specifically the bran, the germ, and the husk. Now, while the husk is inedible, the bran and the germ have significant nutrient benefits, but they are being removed. What remains in a refined grain is basically the endosperm, which contains starch and protein. There's also other nutrients that are lost in the processing of a refined grain. Very frequently, B vitamins as well as various minerals are also removed. The next category are the enriched grains, and these are the ones who have already been refined, but by regulation have to have certain nutrients added back. Those nutrients include thiamine, riboflavin, folate, iron, and niacin. Then we have the term fortified. Fortified foods, or more specifically fortified grains that we're talking about, have nutrients added that weren't present in the original food. Probably the best example when we're talking about fortified grains include dry cereal. Dry cereal is often made from refined grains with large doses of various vitamins and minerals added to them. But since they're coming from a refined grain, they are not including that beneficial bran or germ. The last term to note is whole grain, and this is a term that you really want to be very familiar with. Whole grain products are not refined, which means that they have not had the germ and the bran removed. They tend to have higher nutritional value overall. Examples of whole grain products include brown rice, wild rice would fall under this category, barley, quinoa, as well as oats. Now, another point to note when we're talking about whole grain is that if you're selecting breads or cereals, crackers, things along that line, you want to make sure that they specifically say whole grain on the label. If it just says wheat bread or if it just says wheat cracker, you are not getting the intact grain. The bread has to say whole grain or whole wheat. Usually it'll also say 100% next to that term. Often if it's just a wheat bread, if you look at the ingredient list, the first ingredient is just going to be enriched wheat flour, which means that the main ingredient has been refined. The term that you need to look for is whole. Whole is the key to let you know that you are getting a product of a higher nutritional level. Now on the next slide, you'll be able to look at the comparison of the nutrients in various types of bread. They're going to include whole grain bread compared to enriched bread compared to unenriched bread. And you really will see the advantage of selecting that whole grain product. Here is that example of an actual grain, or most specifically of a wheat plant. The very outer layer, that's what's referred to as the husk. And basically that's inedible and it doesn't have any type of nutritional value. However, right under that layer is where we find the bran portion. And that's where the fiber is located, which we'll address in detail in Chapter 4, as well as many nutrients. The endosperm is more so the middle of the grain itself, and that's high in starch as well as protein content. The germ portion is actually the seed part of the plant, and this is where many vitamins and minerals are located. So how about the fruit group? What are some good choices here? Well, in general, citrus fruits such as oranges or grapefruits, limes, and lemons, as well as yellow or orange fruits, so think peaches, cantaloupes, apricots, they tend to be very high in vitamin C, potassium, as well as other minerals, and they're a good source of fiber. Brightly colored fruits in general are a good choice because in addition to the many nutrients present, they contain what we call phytochemicals. And we'll discuss phytochemicals further along in the semester. What about choosing fresh fruit versus frozen fruit? Well, consider that these basically are comparable. Most fruits are flash frozen immediately after harvesting. So nutrient content is actually well preserved and is comparable to a fresh fruit. You may want to be a little bit more careful though when we're talking about canned fruit. If it's noted as being packed in heavy syrup, the sugar content can be high. Canned fruit, however, that is packed in water or natural juice is a much better choice. What about fruit juice? Yes, it can be healthy. It's a good source of nutrients, but it is often high in sugar, albeit it is natural sugar. And we'll discuss the difference between added sugar and natural sugar as we progress into Chapter 4. As far as the better selections of fruit juice, focus on those that are listed on the label as being 100% juice. Often products may contain only 10 to 20% fruit juice, with the majority coming from high fructose corn syrup in general, or other sugary sources. These tend not to be as nutritionally balanced as one that is truly 100% juice. Another word of caution is that if the label states that it is a fruit cocktail or a fruit aid, it tends to contain very little natural juice. Vegetables are also a great source of a variety of nutrients. As with fruits, go for those that are brightly colored. Often that's an indication again of those important phytochemicals. Vegetables in general are a good source of fiber, which we'll discuss that in much more depth in chapter 4, and we'll look at the health benefit of incorporating fiber on a regular basis. The same principle applies as far as fresh versus frozen as with the fruits, whereas they really will be comparable in nutritional value. Again, the vegetables would be flash frozen immediately after harvesting, again, preserving the large amount of nutrients that are present. Canned vegetables also can be an option. They can be nutrient rich, but many of them may contain high amounts of sodium. There are canned veggies on the market that are not packed in sodium, so you can certainly choose those. Or you can simply be sure to rinse off the canned veggies, which will help to remove some of that excess sodium. Another category of veggies are the legumes. And the legumes include things like dried peas, dried beans, lentils, soybeans, kidney beans, pinto beans, peanuts are some examples. They tend to be very economical. You can often buy a large bag in the grocery store and get many, many meals out of those. They are also nutrient rich, and you're also going to incorporate a large amount of fiber from this particular category. As I had previously noted, protein sources come from both animal-based and plant-based foods. Incorporating both of these can help assure a diverse group of nutrients. For animal-based protein, cuts of meat, which are noted as being a round cut or a loin cut, are going to be leaner with a lower percentage of fat, especially saturated fat. Other terms of which to be aware: select versus choice versus prime. A select cut is going to be the leanest, whereas a prime cut is going to be the fattiest. A choice cut is kind of somewhere in the middle with more likely a moderate amount of fat. You also want to watch your food preparation methods. Baking, roasting, broiling, grilling, braising are all methods used without adding any additional fat. Trimming off visible fat before cooking is also recommended, as well as draining away any fat which may tend to pool at a high temperature from the meat itself. Removing the skin from poultry will also help to remove that layer of fat which is often attached, therefore decreasing overall fat intake and once again more likely saturated fat. The last food group to note is the milk or the dairy group. Now, milk and dairy products are great sources of protein, calcium, riboflavin, and most of the dairy products on the market are also fortified with both vitamin A and vitamin D. Vitamin A in particular is added to any milk or milk product that has been skimmed or has had fat removed. The vitamin A that's in there originally is removed through that skimming process, so it's put back in. And then vitamin D is often added because vitamin D is necessary for efficient absorption of the natural calcium content of milk. Then another thing to note with the milk and dairy is the differences in fat content. They can run from non-fat or skim all the way up to full fat or whole milk. And often people ask, well, which type of milk or dairy should I be consuming? The non-fat or the full fat version? And it really depends on the individual. The type of fat that's in milk in general is saturated fat, which is not a healthy type of fat or a heart healthy type of fat specifically. So if you consume a lot of milk, if you consume a lot of dairy, it really is recommended that you go towards the side of the lower fat products or the non-fat products. However, if you don't consume a lot of dairy, maybe, occasionally, and you want to have a full fat version, that certainly is not as much of an issue. We go back to that term moderation and knowing what the proper balance is. As with the milks you can get in different types or different percentages of fat, the same thing applies to yogurts and cheeses, so you can use kind of the same guidelines to make those appropriate selections. Reading food labels has become more common as consumers become more focused on healthy food selections. Recently, the FDA redesigned the nutrition facts portion of food labels based on newer scientific information, which includes the specific connection between diet and chronic disease. The new label is designed to make it easier for consumers to make those better informed food choices. Some of the things which need to be included with this newer food label, first of all, is the ingredient list. Foods that contain more than one ingredient must contain an ingredient list. So for example, if you pick up a container of coffee or maybe a bag of brown rice, you'll notice that there is not an ingredient list. This is due to the fact that there's just one single ingredient, and there also are not any types of additives, preservatives, other nutrients added. However, any other type of packaged food which contains more than one ingredient has to have the list placed. The ingredients are listed in descending order of predominance by weight, which very simply means that whatever is listed first on the ingredient list is in the food in the largest amount. Whatever is listed last is in the food in the least amount. So for example, if you just take a look at this example of a food ingredient list, you'll see that the first one which is noted is enriched flour. This is telling you that that particular ingredient is in the food in the largest amount. If you go all the way down to the bottom of the list, you'll see where it says defatted wheat germ. That's the last ingredient, so what this is telling you is that this is in the food in the least amount. Any additive, whether it's placed in there as a preservative, coloring, any type of reason that it might be added, vitamins, minerals, all of those, if they are placed into this processed or packaged food, it must be evident on the list itself. Another statement which has to be provided by the food producer is any type of cross-contamination which may be possible. This statement has to include the common allergens that people may come in contact with. These are typically nuts, soy, wheat, milk. If these are potentially in the food, or they might be exposing the food within the facility itself, you will often see the statements may contain nuts, made in a facility which also processes soy or nuts or milk or wheat, etc. Because we seem to have a much larger amount of the population who are now experiencing food allergies, this is now a mandatory part of the label itself. Besides the ingredient information on food labels, the Nutrition Facts Panel also provides valuable nutrition information, which includes serving sizes, nutrient quantities, as well as something we refer to as the daily value. As far as serving sizes go, they are listed on food labels based on the amount of foods and beverages that most people typically consume. A positive with serving sizes is that it allows for comparison among different foods. So for example, you might be looking at the nutrition facts of a half a cup of Breyer's ice cream compared to a half a cup of, say, Edie's ice cream. Serving sizes are the same, yet you'll be able to see any differences or possible similarities as far as nutrient composition goes. Serving sizes also are comparing one particular amount. So you need to compare it to the quantity of food which you may actually be eating. So for example, you pick up a package of cookies. Serving size might be 2 cookies, giving you 150 calories. If you, however, are going to eat 4 cookies, you are consuming 2 of the serving sizes. You need to keep in mind you need to double the amount of calories as well as all the other nutrient information which may be on the particular label. On the other side, if you're only consuming half of the recommended serving size or the suggested serving size, you're going to want to half whatever the calories or nutrient composition may be. In addition to the serving sizes, what else is on the label? Well, nutrient quantities. These are listed in quantity as far as gram amounts, and they are also listed as a percentage of standards which we call the daily values, and we'll talk about those in just a minute. These nutrient quantities include total calories, fat, and then fat is subdivided based on the amount of saturated fat and trans fat, cholesterol, sodium, total carbohydrate, and then total carbohydrate is also subdivided based on the amount of fiber, sugars, as well as added sugars. Protein is listed, vitamin D is listed, calcium, iron, as well as potassium. As I mentioned, these nutrient quantities are listed as a percentage of standards which are called the daily values. And often consumers are a little unsure about what these daily values actually refer to. Well, these daily values, often just abbreviated as DV, they tell you how much of a nutrient in a serving of food contributes basically to your daily diet. The percentages or the numbers are based loosely on a 2,000 calorie a day intake. And that typically is what is used for general nutrition advice. The daily value is a simple way for consumers to see if a food contributes a little of a particular nutrient or maybe a lot of a particular nutrient. If there is 5% or less of the daily value in a food for a particular nutrient, it's considered to be low. However, if there is 20% or more of a daily value of a particular nutrient, this is considered to be high. And like I said on the next slide, we're going to take a look at an actual food label itself, so you will get a better idea of what that actually refers to. Here's an example of a nutrition fact panel, which is taken right from a container of ice cream. Serving size is listed, 2/3 of a cup. You can see the calories are noted in bold. Then all of those other nutrients which I previously mentioned, they are listed in gram amounts as well as that comparison to the daily value. And to use that again as consumers, if we keep in mind that quick guide to interpret these daily values, which includes if there is 5% or less, then there is a low amount of that nutrient. If there's 20% or more, then there's a high amount of that nutrient in whatever the particular food may be. So for example, if you look at the percentage of the daily value of iron in this serving of ice cream, what you're going to see is that it's 45%. That's above that 20%, so it's telling you that there's a lot of that particular nutrient in this food. Despite the recent food label revisions, consumers can still find the nutrition facts panel to be somewhat confusing or even overwhelming. Some food manufacturers have actually taken it one step further and created front of package labels. These tend to be a bit simpler compared to the labels that you have to find on the back of the package or on the side of the package. They also at this point are voluntary. They are not required to be placed on particular packaged foods. However, if you look at the example, you could see how simple they are to be able to assess the various important nutrients that might be in a particular product. Right on the front of the package, it will tell you how many calories are provided per serving, how many grams of saturated fat, how many milligrams of sodium, how many grams of sugars, how many milligrams of potassium, as well as how many grams of fiber. It also helps that for those 4 nutrients designated, it also gives you the percentage of the daily value that you're going to meet by consuming these particular foods. It's also easier because when you're looking at a food on the shelf, this is right at your eye level. You don't have to pick up the food, turn it around. So it might actually be beneficial when you're trying to get through the grocery store if more food manufacturers incorporated these front of package labels.